Well, our next speaker has already received, I think, 5 or 6 name checks already. So I'm now just here to welcome the Director General of ACI Europe, Olivier Jankovic. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be in Prague again. And I'd like to thank first the Czech presidency for hosting this event, and also beyond that for their leadership on aviation files this semester. So thank you, Zdenek, for all the excellent cooperation. Thanking EASA, of course, Patrick and his team for putting airports at the main scene for this event. We're very happy about that. We don't fear EASA anymore, Patrick. Those days are long gone. I think we've come a long way indeed. We've invested on both sides a significant resource in time, and I think now I can say it's been a win-win relationship, certainly. I'd like to echo what you said about the Health Aviation Safety Protocol. This was crucial for us for restarting, and I know how difficult this has been, dealing with ECDC in particular. And also, more generally now, I'd like to commend also your and your team's openness and progressive approach when we look at innovative air mobility. What I'd like to do now is set the scene a little bit more in detail. I mean, Zdenek has covered already a lot of themes, and Patrick also. But looking at where we stand as airports, as an industry today in Europe, and what we see as our main challenges and the change we need to embrace moving forward. At the moment, of course, we're finally turning the corner from the COVID crisis, but with renewed challenges, both in the short and the longer term. Looking at traffic, clearly it has recovered. It started to improve in the spring when Omicron receded, travel restrictions were lifted. And as you can see, over the peak summer months, we got closer to pre-pandemic levels. Although when we look at October, it seems it's plateauing a little bit. And when we look year to date, since January, we're still at 22% below pre-pandemic levels, 2019 for EU plus airports. So still some way to go. What is interesting is that, of course, the dynamics of the recovery has been very different across the different segments of the airport industry, from the very big hubs and larger airports on the left down to the right, to the smaller airports, group 4, minus than 5 million passengers per year. What we can see is that the smaller airports have actually, as of October, achieved a full recovery to pre-pandemic traffic levels, whereas the larger airports, of course, are handicapped by the fact that there are still travel restrictions on external market, in particular in Asia and China. Another interesting factor now that we're seeing in the recovery is that the national markets are recovering at a very different pace, and that's a bit new. Last year, everybody was kind of recovering at the same speed. This, of course, is the impact of the war, which is impacting some markets more than others. On the left here, you can see airports in Finland and Latvia, for example. And conversely, it's also the fact that the recovery remains driven a lot by leisure traffic, which is a boom for airports that are located in the southern parts of Europe, mainly in tourism destinations, as you can see. And of course, we have markets which have been discovered by low-cost carriers, especially Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, which are really, really booming. Of course, this has been mentioned. We've been facing significant operational challenges this summer. The traffic beated our expectation, fueled by repressed travel or revenge spending, as it was been called. But indeed, we have handled, between January and August, 3 times the passenger volume we were handling the preceding years. And you can see the boost in some markets was really, really impressive. And the main reason, of course, for the key driver for the operational disruptions we've gone through is the acute staff shortages and the strikes, impacting all actors in the aviation ecosystem, impacting some markets more than others, and resulting in significant disruptions and constraining some major airports to temporarily reduce their capacity. But it is clear that there's no magic wand in how we solve this. And I think it's important to stress that this has also reflected, to some extent, how states decided to support or not to support so much their airports and ground handlers throughout the COVID crisis. Looking at the ground handling market in particular, I think the recovery has laid bare a number of structural issues as regards social conditions and organizational processes. This has impacted both performance and resilience, and we have engaged with the European Commission and Member States over these issues through an ad hoc position paper that we have just sent out last month. And I think for us the focus should be on the ability of airports to better be in control of their spaces, of the way stakeholders are using their facilities, and that means more coordination for ground handling. And this is why also we very much support the forthcoming EASA regulation on ground handling. I think this is going to be an opportunity not just to enhance safety, but as alluded to by Patrick, also to clarify the respective role and responsibilities between the different actors. Beyond these difficult ramp-up issues, we of course have now war in Europe, a conflict with no end in sight and constant threats of escalation. And this is impacting first and foremost, of course, our Ukrainian airport members who have lost all traffic. But for the European airport network in general, over time, I think the impact of the war is likely to come from renewed supply pressures. Those supply pressures were already a worry in the recovery of COVID before the war, mainly because we've seen network airlines downsizing quite a bit and because we had slot waivers. But now, of course, we have the spike in the price of oil and we have the increase of the dollar, which is going to lead some airlines to be more cautious in putting capacity in the market. And we've seen, and we are seeing, significant increase in airfares. And that obviously translates into demand pressures. But apart from airfares, I think those demand pressures will also come from the wider macroeconomic impact of the war. And I'm talking here about disruptions to supply chain and global trade. We're seeing that already. And of course, inflation, which is at record level. I think in October, we were at 11% for the Eurozone. Here in Czech Republic, it's 15%. And of course, this is weighing on consumer and business confidence. So all this means that we're likely to see much more downward risk for air traffic. Although for now, I must say, traffic is holding up, demand is still there. But clearly a lot of uncertainty as to how the market will behave in the next year. And this is why we continue for now to forecast a full recovery in terms of passenger volumes compared to 2019 only in 2024. Looking ahead, I think what we are seeing coming up is a new aviation paradigm. First, because demand has changed, is changing. I think the jury is still out as to how much demand has changed through COVID and through what we're going through now. The market has not yet stabilized, but I think there's distinct and new demand patterns that have accelerated through COVID. Of course, it's about leisure and VFR being king. This is a boost for low-cost carriers. Interestingly, it's also a boost for the premium cabins from leisure demand for some network carriers. We have, of course, leisure and blended travel. Demand is also turning greener as we see an increasing willingness of travelers to lessen their environmental impact. And this is, of course, increasingly the case for corporates, for business travel. I think we're seeing business travel coming back much more slowly, and it's clear that business travel in the future is going to be increasingly decided on sustainability criteria. And there, of course, the recent ranking published of global companies based on their commitment and action to reduce corporate travel only confirms that. Down the line, of course, we'll see demand being potentially, in terms of demand growth, less domestic, less European, and more international. That reflects, of course, simply huge differences in the propensity to fly and the fact that the European market is a more mature market. Changes in demand along with new aircraft technology will also impact air connectivity. The report we published last June shows how air connectivity is being impacted and reshaped by the pandemic. In particular, you can see here total air connectivity is still 30% down as of last June compared to pre-pandemic levels. And very interestingly, we can see that the recovery in direct connectivity has been much quicker than the recovery in hub connectivity. But our new aviation paradigm will also see increasing airline dominance, clearly. And just looking at the capacity that airlines have been deploying in the airport market this winter, we can see who the winners are. ultra-low-cost carriers, Ryanair and Wizz Air in particular. We can see that the network carriers are still this winter offering capacity much beyond their pre-pandemic levels. I think it's interesting to see also how the continued travel restrictions in Asia are impacting the capacity that the Gulf carriers are putting into the European market. But I think clearly Ryanair and Wizz Air are very well positioned beyond the pandemic for the impact of the war and the prospect of a recession. And that's because when there's inflation, consumers trade down. That's because they have a young fleet. That's a natural hedge against higher oil prices. They've been upgauging, they keep lowering their unit costs, they've broadened their network, they're going into primary market. And last but not least, they also have a massive order for new aircraft to be delivered in the next 10 years. Meanwhile, the network carriers have retrenched. That's clear from the data I've shown on capacity this winter. Some of them have been clearly heavily supported by their states, and they're also restricted. But we see them for now really chasing higher yields, increasing their fares, and not much looking at increasing their market shares. Airline consolidations, of course, is still on the cards, although it is happening more by attrition at the moment rather than by mergers. So if we take all these things together, for us airports, they only mean one thing: increasing airport competition. We are about to release in the coming weeks a study from Frontier Economics, which analyzes the dynamics of airport competition through COVID and the recovery. But as you can see from those quotes already from Reuters and even from Lufthansa, I think it's clear that airport competition is a reality that, unfortunately, too many of our regulators are still ignoring. But beyond those structural changes in aviation, I think we need to look at the big picture, because clearly there are new fundamentals, not just for aviation, for the economy, that will have a profound impact on businesses. First and foremost, this is about living and traveling with COVID-19. We might not yet be fully done with the pandemic, and we know there will be probably other pandemics we'll have to deal with. At the same time, we have a much more instable environment on the geopolitical sides. Clearly, increasingly, decisions by governments are driven by security parameters, all of which is putting an end to globalization as we've known it. And for now, we are in the war economy, which means we're pretty much in uncharted territory. And of course, there is the existential threat of global warming. I think the issue is no longer whether we can stop climate change, but how we can adapt to it. So clearly, with all that, the big picture for aviation and airport is increasingly about disruptions and volatility, slower traffic growth potentially compared to what we would have expected, and of course, societal relevance. All this means that we have to manage more uncertainty, more risk, and more complexity. And there are really two key challenges that are standing out for us. The first one is about airport economics. Clearly, we are coming out of the COVID crisis in a situation of financial weakness. We've lost 20 billion euro over the past 2 years. And clearly, we got much less financial support than what some airlines could get from their government, which left airports with no other choice than to grow their debt. Look at this figure, plus 60 billion increase in debt and liabilities for airports over the past 2 years. This is massive, and it means only one thing, is that we're going to have to use an increasing share of our revenue to repay the debt. For now, in addition, we see the recovery as being quite cost-intensive because the traffic tends to be more concentrated over peak times, but at the same time, it's quite revenue weak because the overall volume are still below 2019 level. And we do face structural cost pressures because of the prospect of slower volume growth, more competition, more digital competition also when we look at our non-aeronautical activities. And now these structural revenue pressures are combining with structural cost increases due to inflation largely. For airport staff and energy amounts to about 45% of their operating expenses. So clearly that is challenging our economic model because the airport economic model is predicated on the assurance of continued dynamic growth in traffic. And we know we're not going to get this assurance moving forward. So That is exposing Europe's airports to an investment capacity, an investment crunch. And if we look at the figure, we can see already that airports have reduced significantly their investment over the past 2 years. The second challenge for us is, of course, decarbonization and societal acceptability, clearly. This is no longer about having our license or earning our license to grow. It is increasingly becoming about keeping our license to operate, as, of course, the example of what the Dutch government has decided to do with Schiphol, reducing drastically the capacity of the airport is showing. Meanwhile, the European Union is going through an unprecedented and necessary policy and regulatory reset with Fit for 55, and we know this will impact the economics of aviation. But more broadly, I think addressing decarbonization and societal acceptability means securing access to finance. It means securing access to human capital. And we know that if we don't move fast enough on these things, we will have a lot of problems. So that means overall, we have, as businesses, as airports, and I think as the rest of the aviation ecosystem, we have no option than to transition and transform. And that means reshaping our future, not just by embracing ESG, environment, social, and governance, but clearly by pivoting towards a new airport value creation model, where less can actually be more, when we can go back to longer-term planning horizons, when we focus on connectivity with positive externalities, while at the same time looking at new business opportunities. And that new airport value creation model can only be based on 3 pillars: sustainability, innovation, and diversification, which I think all tie in very well with the themes and the panel we will have today and tomorrow. Let me briefly go through each of them. Clearly, when we look at sustainability, this is about our license to exist, not just as businesses, but as humans, and we have no other choice than to lead, like the CEO of BlackRock says very well. This is why we see airports now in Europe accelerating decarbonization. The airport community last June renewed its commitment to achieve net zero CO2 emission by 2050. And actually, we're seeing an increasing number of airports setting the targets much earlier to 2030. And all that is underpinned by the very concrete works of airports under airport carbon accreditation. But I think increasingly it's not just about those emissions that we control as airport operators, the so-called Scope 1 and 2 emissions. It's also about addressing Scope 3 emissions, those emissions that we facilitate, and in particular the emissions from our partner airlines. This is why, as ACI, we've been partnering with A4E and ERA on Destination 2050. This is why also we've published last June some guidance looking at how airports can work to help airlines reduce their own emissions. And this is why also we've partnered with Airbus to facilitate the development of new energy at airports. All this is core to our business transformation based on a holistic approach where we look at co-benefits on the environmental side, and also when we need to look beyond the airport side at territorial integration, multimodality. And that means that airports need to embrace an extended scope of activities and responsibilities. Ultimately, this will involve moving airports from being also airports. That means rethinking capacity, not just in aeronautical terms, but in terms of the deployment of green energy, not just for the airports and the users, but also for their communities. I think that's really an exciting prospect for airports to boost their societal credential. And whether we do this by electrification and green hydrogen, of course, we will need a supporting regulatory framework from EASA, including as regards the certification of new equipment. Turning to innovation, clearly this is about operational performance and resilience, and this is about competitiveness, of course, our ability to keep attracting and retain airline business. We know what the great enablers are there. It's digitalization, artificial intelligence, automation, and there's a lot of applications we're going to see down the road, including, of course, boosting safety and security as always. But to drive and lead this innovation agenda, I think what is really remarkable is that now airports are looking at being co-creators and investors, not just buyers of ready-made solutions. We're seeing a lot of airport group of airport operators developing their own innovation lab. And there, of course, the challenge will be scalability, standardization, and this is where we also look forward to work more closely with EASA on this. Coming down, this is also why airports are, of course, very committed to CESAR. Now to the last pillar, diversification. This is about economic performance and quality. On the aeronautical side, it means having a diversified airline portfolio for diversified air connectivity. No airport these days can rely on just one airline. That means still investing, of course, probably a bit less in capacity, but more in sustainability, in operational performance, in maintenance. But we know that this requires a long overdue regulatory alignment, first on airport charges around the user pays principle. Airports need more pricing freedom and flexibility that recognizes the fact that they are competing, but also on slots, where the rules we have are quite old. They give a lot of flexibility to some airlines, and that is at the cost of the airports. And this is why we're also very supportive of the agenda of the European Commission to revisit the existing EU slot regulation. Looking on the non-aeronautical slide, as ever, it's going to be about quality, hospitality, and building the brand equity of the airports to maximize commercial revenues. And that means evolving our offering and services around sustainability, customization, and experience. Finally, for some airports, diversification means also going international. Europe is home to major airport groups that have become global leaders in terms of airport development. I think clearly they are exporting their know-how. That's a way of diversifying their revenues. But what is often not really seen is that they're also at the same time championing climate actions beyond Europe. So we're seeing airports increasingly working on these three pillars: sustainability, innovation, diversification. And we have a lot of examples of how airports are embracing and charting the way forward as local businesses in their own right, focused on delivering value for all their stakeholders. Such examples include Aeroporto di Roma, which is Scareport concept, the recent strategic plan Pioneers of Groupe ADP, or the Shift plan of Brussels Airport, but of course there are many more. But I think what is very important is that as we chart these transformation strategies, I think it's very clear that we need them to be enabled by our policymakers and regulators so that no airport community is left behind. And in this regard, having more flexible and not one-size-fits-all regulation is going to be more and more critical. And this is, of course, amongst the many key challenges that we as ACI Europe are looking at working upon and address for and with our members always. Thank you very much. Thank you, EASA, for this event.
Thank you very much, Olivier.